Well, welcome to the next episode of the Christ-Centered Cosmic Civilization, and we're going to look at something different today. We're going to look at the problem of drugs in a way, and we looked at it when we looked at pharmacon and the issue of pharmacology and how the Bible addresses it really as a kind of idolatry issue, and that if we look to the Lord God for what we need, then his help comes through all kinds of creatures, including things we eat and drink and so on. But if we look to the creatures themselves as the source of help, that becomes a problem, and all sorts of difficulties arise. Now, let's apply that to a specific issue of a substance that now is quite commonly used as a drug, and many people feel that they require it every day. In many communities, it's like very common usage, and as you walk through those communities, you'll smell it quite openly, and see people just consuming it, brazenly on the streets. And it's become such a part of those cultures that it's even children are introduced to it, and I say that cautiously because it is it's obviously a disturbing thing, but even children are introduced to its consumption, and even it's kind of liked if even the children become dependent upon it, and parents might even buy equipment for the children to help them get into becoming dependent upon it. But it's something that our Christian ancestors were generally quite horrified about, and even made illegal, as we'll hear, and preached against it and so on. But now, I don't think there's very, very few Christians. There are some Christians still preaching against it even today, but very few. It's become so, it's like, why bother? It's legalized, well, effectively legalized everywhere. What are we talking about? We're talking about coffee, of course, something which our Christian ancestors were horrified by, but now they're not. And even quite mature Christians that I know boast about their dependence on this drug, and how they just can't function without it. And even ministers I know, like, I was going to say furtively, converse with other ministers about their preferences, and they know dealers who can get them better of the drug and how to prepare it better, and they have like very expensive equipment to prepare it and so on. I was going to say they do that furtively because you would assume they would, but actually, no. I've even seen ministers posting quite openly about the dependence on this drug and the enthusiastic usage of it. And I wasn't going to say this, but I think I need to. Churches actually feature offering this drug at church events. Just recently, I heard, I was at a church service, and at the conclusion of it, the worship leader, and it's maybe the wrong use of words, the title to give to such a visit, but they literally just said, please go and collect your coffee at the desk at the end of it, as if like just openly said that. Now, I admit, like many of us, I feel have become compromised on this and perhaps don't see the problem of it. What we're going to do is ask PJ from the Global Church History Project to give us some therapy on this, really, and help us to understand the coffee usage, where that originates from, how it was perceived by our Christian ancestors, and something about how Christians resisted it, and when they stopped doing that.
Right, so the history of it is that really its initial usage was entirely pagan. So there was a group of Nilotic people, so that's like East African sort of people, related to the Maasai. A lot of people outside Africa still know about like the Maasai. There's a group related to them called the Oromo, and they live in the south of Ethiopia, and they discovered this drug, and they start using it, and it kind of is especially used by their sorcerers. And when one of their sorcerers would die, they would plant a coffee bean at his burial site so that he will become a coffee tree and continue to cast sorcery through this drug. So that was the kind of history of it. So when the Oromo were they're kind of originally from Ethiopia, but then they expanded out to other parts of Ethiopia. And as they did this, they brought this drug with them. And Christians were horrified by it. So quite quickly after this was introduced, there was all kinds of laws totally prohibiting planting it and cultivating it. Like previously, we thought about all the Christian laws which made basically weed totally extinct in the vast majority of Europe. And, it was only in places where they needed rope close to the coasts, really, that still had it. They were hoping they could stamp out coffee with similar sort of measures, but they sadly weren't so successful because then basically some Sufis, you'll know they're like kind of a sect of Islam that are very into ecstatic stuff.
A kind of mystical form of Islam, isn't it? And the idea is to whip yourself up either through physical activities, like the concept of whirling around sometimes, but mostly it's like a mystical form of Islam. Yeah, carry on. Yeah.
So they had already tried to normalize weed, which obviously in most forms of Islam that is totally prohibited. But they had said, actually, no, it's really cool because it feels like you're getting to know God a bit more. And then they
would actually believe that drug, a bit like the Doors guy, where he would believe that taking drugs would open the doors of perception and enable him to be more spiritual. This goes right back to the coffee use by the Sufis. Yeah.
So they had so then they kind of like at one point almost abandoned weed because they were like, wow, coffee is where it's at. And so they just get it, loads of it. And so they kind of establish themselves in Yemen, and there's this port of Mocha where they get...
Mocha?
Yeah. They get all this coffee imported. So the Ethiopian Empire is actually unable to stamp out coffee in its regions because there's so much interest in basically smuggling this drug out of the country that it becomes a massive business, and these cartels are too powerful to just totally stamp out. So it gets proliferated, and really at that time only in the south, where the Oromo people are still most popular. So that was basically what happened, that this Christian empire had this massive cartel operating for hundreds of years.
The Christian empire were running it, or were they doing
They were
war on drugs, really, and they were trying to fight against the cartel,
Yeah, and so this cartel was supplying Sufists with the coffee they needed for their ecstatic experiences. But yeah, if you read some Ethiopian fathers from that time, they talk in absolute horror because they're like, it seemed like someone's possessed by a demon. And to this day, there's a sort of category of demon they refer to as a Buddha, Buddha, and that's the word they have for coffee. It's the same word. So even now, sadly, even in modern Ethiopia, there's been a lot of... So, you can't go to holy sites of Michael if you're high on coffee.
Even today? You can't. So they certainly wouldn't be serving coffee at that church site. Yeah.
But no, I've known... An Ethiopian was just telling me the other day that he went to a monastery and they had coffee there.
What?
Yeah. So
the cartel had even managed to get into an Ethiopian monastery. Were the the leadership of the monastery are aware that there was a coffee dealer inside the monastery.
Well, he wasn't going into too much detail. I think he only saw a monk.
I bet he didn't go into detail.
Yeah. Too sordid stuff. So there's all this, and then so there's a holy spring of Michael, and there's still a belief that Michael will not tolerate people who are on this substance.
The Archangel Michael will have nothing to do with such drug users,
Yeah. So, but then, it was only in the 1880s that it started to become normalized in Ethiopia. And in the early 19th century, you get these British travellers, and they are actually barred from holy sites because they say, we know what the British are like. They're always high on coffee. So, we're just not going to risk it. We're not going to let you into these holy sites for that reason. So,
because just British people in general were perceived as coffee drinkers.
Yeah.
And therefore don't let any British in.
Yeah. Well, coffee and tobacco, that was the other thing they felt.
Yeah. But it's funny because, quite a lot of Christians are today quite antagonistic to the use of tobacco. But not coffee. So it's an interesting one how they've accepted one but rejected the other. But anyway, carry on that. So the British were banned for the coffee use.
Yeah, but then what happens towards the end of the 19th century, partly because the Ethiopians even before that point, they loved the British. They were just disappointed that we'd given up on this particular fight. But because earlier on in the reign of King Charles the Martyr, the coffee was banned, and there was all sorts of leaflets going around telling people, about the dangers of coffee and all of this. People really trying to wake them up.
Oh, well, wake them up. Yeah, that's the problem. Wake them up to the dangers of coffee. So that's in the early 17th century then. So we're really looking at 400 years ago. King Charles nearly 400 years ago, King Charles the Martyr's really saying, or people that godly people in his time, they recognised the danger of it. Is that when coffee was first really? Well, is it in the 16th century that it starts to get into Europe?
Yeah.
And then, so by the 17th century, the mature Christians in England at that time saw the threat of it and attempted to... Was it banned, did you say?
Yeah. King Charles the Martyr did make it illegal. Not as much as that Murad, the Ottoman Emperor, made it on pain of death.
Murad, did he?
Yeah, Murad the Fourth.
So he could see that it had obviously become widespread in the Ottoman Empire because Muslims were using it. I mean, the Sufis, obviously, it was core to their religious practices. It was almost like a sacrament, kind of. But I suppose Muslims in general were using it, were they?
Beginning to, and so it was worrying. It was worrying because it's just there's these hadiths that are saying, you can't use any drugs. Similar, how we've thought about the scriptures that say that. And so then they were worried, there's this one drug which is just massively taking off. And so he had it on pain of death, you couldn't, drug possession, really trying to crack down on this drug possession. So there were similar laws there, but then Venice was trading. They had all these trading rights with the Ottoman Empire. And so they were bringing it into Europe. So they're the ones who introduced it in the 16th century.
Via Venice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was, so they were kind of acting as a cartel, obviously, within the Ottoman Empire. They'd be able to trade things around, and then they brought it into Europe, and then they really pushed hard to normalize it. And it's this quite disappointing thing where you have, so much of the Catholic clergy were trying to fight the good fight against this drug. And then at one point you just have a pope saying, but it smells so delicious. And then, so then he says, it's okay then. And then it's you feel like there needed to be a more thorough process of investigation. And I feel similarly with Ethiopia. The arguments that, Ethiopia at the time when they normalized it, it was that, the Coptic Pope used coffee because he was part of the Ottoman Empire, so they knew some Coptic popes that did it, so that normalized it. And then the British, they were doing it. And then at one point you get the Emperor of Ethiopia, Menelik II, and not only did he drink coffee, but his cousin, I believe called Walter Michael, was one of the main coffee dealers. in the country. So then, because Menelik was so highly thought of, it became normalized. And then in the 1880s, I believe, they suspended all the laws against coffee ownership, use, the whole lot. So that's the kind of history there. And I suppose the very disappointing thing for a Christian is like, well, we've thought about how like some things you could think of as drugs, but then we think, oh, we should think of it as medicine because it's for this. And, and Paul describes alcohol that way. He says Timothy should have some wine for his stomach. But then there's a careful process of like examining it and thinking, what's it for? How's it used as medicine? And then was just saying, oh, it smells so yummy is
so
like
that which pope was that? Do you remember? No, you can't remember.
No, it was in 1600. But yeah, obviously, yeah.
So for him, he's like, well, it is evil, but smells nice. So,
Yeah.
but I do feel like, if we just stay on him for a moment, that kind of very poor theological thinking about these sorts of things, and he's like, let's hold him up as one of the poorest examples. That is quite typical, I think, is that people go, I like it.
Yeah.
So he's just saying, I like the smell of it. But I think generally, like I just recently I was looking at Christians and coffee, and today, and there was just a huge amount of kind of merchandise around, people, like even theological podcasts and things about theology with coffee and things like that, as if you're supposed to actually consume this mood-altering, mind-altering drug whilst listening to the theological podcast. And one of them even offered like coffee mugs and things that you could...
And presumably bongs and stuff as well. I mean...
I assume so. I didn't go onto the other tabs available on the merchandise, but presumably they did. And syringes and so on, and they obviously provide that. But I only looked at the coffee mugs section, because maybe I should see the other paraphernalia they offer. But it seems strange, doesn't it, that the argument really, whenever it's I like it.
Yeah.
And I guess, okay, but then people may like all kinds of activities and substances, which may not be quite sufficient a reason to declare them good or moral. Because that mind-altering... I heard this... I'm not absolutely sure on this, but I do have a recollection that Calvin, in John Calvin's Geneva, he didn't like alcohol. So he thought that was a bad, even though the scripture actually does affirm a certain amount of alcohol use. So that is positive there. But he wanted to close those down and replace them with, I believe, coffee shops. Now think about that like coffee is just a mood, like overtly people who like it for its mood altering and mind altering properties, and that there's a Christian leader who is overtly attempting to set them up because he feels it's a better thing, it's a better drug to consume than and having inns or pubs or taverns and things. And maybe I've recalled that wrongly. Presumably that can't have actually happened, but I believe it did. I think there was an attempt to actually have more promote coffee as a sort of a better thing in Geneva. And I know that today there's a lot of coffee shops in Geneva. But nevertheless, so it's the level of argument that we're concerned about here. So in the 17th century, that's when the doors really, the gates kind of are broken, really. And although, as you say, King Charles the Martyr still resists, but after him,
well, Goethe, the Holy Roman scholar and politician,
right?
So even though he was so-called free thinker and everything, so he's not a Christian fundamentalist even, but he had tried to reinvigorate this anti-coffee mood, because he was like, even if you're just a nominal Lutheran, it was still like, well, that's obviously Christians can't be doing that. So he was still trying to crack down on it. So you didn't have to be super far down the kind of fundamentalist rabbit hole to be anti-coffee. And so, but then some like rationalists and everything hated Goethe for that, because they were like, oh, isn't that ridiculous? He wants alcohol. He wants to get rid of coffee. But then it's like, well, actually, that had been the Christian norm since coffee had been discovered.
Wow.
So he was, even him, like basically a humanist almost. Like a bit more Christian than a humanist, but basically, was still like, you know, even if you were cultural Christian, there was this feeling you can't be doing that.
You can't be having coffee. And I know that it's Voltaire, the 18th century anti-Christian thinker, Voltaire. It says that he would drink 40 to 50 cups of coffee a day.
Wow.
And
like
then,
a proper junkie.
Yeah, you're like a proper junkie. And I guess that would help to explain why you end up being an atheist. And why all possible clear thought about the Lord Jesus Christ would be impossible to him. I know that Immanuel Kant also was quite an enthusiastic coffee drinker. And that nearly all of the those kind of what they themselves would be called free thinkers, they were coffee addicts. So Goethe possibly was like, whoa, look what happens if you start consuming coffee. Yeah, okay, carry on, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, so that's like going all the way to, I mean, basically the 19th century, isn't it? When you think about that, there will be some sentiment that's still quite anti-coffee then. And then today, in a lot of wellness stuff, you do still have people saying, oh, you got to get rid of caffeine and everything. And so we see this still.
So that's interesting, because the health benefits, like we thought about tobacco and coffee, and that now Christians will say, don't have tobacco because it's bad for your health. But you're right, like many health people say coffee is bad for you.
Yeah.
But that's not taken seriously, I presume.
Yeah, and especially because you think about like the knock-on effects of things. So you think like with weed, it's like there's such a high level of psychosis. That's why there's this stigma. It's like
that's in coffee use, did you say?
Oh no, in weed. But like,
weed,
you know,
yeah, weed as well. Yeah,
yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
But it's like you think like, oh, it's not harming me, but it's like, well, it's harming your mind, and that means you can harm other people. And then it's similar with that when you think like, well, there's knock-on effects. So you think, well, all it's doing is waking me up and giving me. But it's like it also has this connection with stress, and that's this big killer in it. So it's like you just narrow it down to like, oh, it's not hurting me because that's not bad. But it's like, but that can cause things. You know what I mean? It's like so narrowly thinking that it's quite silly, really.
Yeah, and like I quite like Kierkegaard, but he was a notorious coffee drinker, and it's no wonder he wrote a book called Fear and Trembling. No wonder he was always stressed out and on his own and couldn't integrate with people. But let's think about, because the Ethiopians were our hope on this, really, that they were. I mean, they were on the front line of trying to stop it ever getting out, and they war on drugs nearly always fail because people just use drugs and they want them, and that obviously the Christian Ethiopians were trying to contain it, but there were others who weren't, and then obviously this ends up becoming a global problem. But and I hesitate to say this, but is it not the case that even the Ethiopians have actually given up the theological resistance to it? You better tell us this sad story, because I know in my mind I was like, oh, but at least like the Oriental Orthodox are super strong on this, led by the Ethiopians. But even they haven't, in modern times, have weakened. Is that fair to say?
I think it is, and it's quite a sordid history related with coffee. I was reading, there's a guy, he's written a book called, I think, A Stranger at the Feast, And it talks about the history of coffee and its relationship with the church and everything, how the church had banned it. And in one particular instance, he looks at how, the church was totally against it. But then some people in the church become some of the biggest slave owners in the world in the 19th century. Because obviously you've got the Civil War in America that abolishes that. So then kind of the largest owners of slaves are some of these people. And
this is in East Africa. So there's some of the largest slave owners.
Yeah, well, yeah. So these people in Ethiopian, like, compared to anyone in the world, they've got the most slaves, really. They're, like, really trafficking this. And then they kind of need something to do with them because they've got all these people they've enslaved and they buy all this land, and then coffee's really easy to grow. And because they're
very profitable.
Yeah, doing all these cartels to the Ottomans and to the Yemenis and so on.
Well, and Europeans and Americans.
Yeah, by that point.
Yeah.
And so that all happens. And so what happens is there's like some translations of the ancient histories of these monasteries and so on that are nearby. And when they translate it from Ge'ez, the ancient language, that they say Enoch spoke this language, and that's the liturgical language of Ethiopia. So in the histories written in Ge'ez, it said like they just grew hops for beer, because that's obviously good in the Bible. And then, they've got fruit, and they've got, I think, buckthorn or something like that. But then they change one of the words, because obviously by that point, everyone drinks coffee instead of beer, because it's totally taking off. So they think, let's do a dynamic translation and change hops to coffee and everything. The dynamic translation theory is the nicer thing, because he mentioned that it could just be a dynamic thing. But possibly, more sinisterly, they've changed this core doctrine where it's like, you can't have drugs. Well, that means you can't have coffee. They've changed it so it's like, actually, coffee's fine. And they've edited these histories. So all the condemnation of coffee is out. And they've actually put coffee into history where it wasn't, to justify a key part of the slave trade, the East African slave trade. And anyway, and this guy in this book, he looks at the continuing strife between the kind of slaves that were brought there to cultivate coffee. And we think also in the European cultivating coffee, it was similarly in the New World, they had all these slaves brought over to get coffee, to make these drugs, to ship to cartels, to get people addicted. The exact same thing was happening in Ethiopia, but it only started kicking in at the end of the 19th century. And then Haile Selassie puts all that slavery and everything to an end. So it doesn't last long, but it is the same impulses of cartels and money and slavery, and that just gets them to say, oh no, it's okay, you can have coffee. But it's just because they needed an internal market to make things as profitable as they could be.
So, as often with drugs, it's very mixed up with money and enslaving people and all of that.
Yeah.
And coffee. And it'd be interesting on that, if, for Christians who are coffee enthusiasts, would that alter their view of coffee if they knew the extent to which it's been involved in slavery and slave trading and so on.
And to this day, you think there's all this fair trade stuff trying to get people more fairly paid, because effectively, even to this day, like, most coffee will be produced in essentially slave conditions.
Yeah, that's right. And that's it, because that's why fair traded coffee is so featured, because it's an attempt to, I suppose in that sense, improve the image of this drug that's so widely available. Is there anything else you'd like to say about coffee, or should we...
Well, I think, it is worth noting, just as we're thinking about what are the effects of all this, and certainly the poor theology that, just saying, oh, but it's yummy, and it's like, so the reason why Christian countries had weed as illegal and coffee as okay is because one smells disgusting, the other one's delicious. And it's like that, well, that's just terrible in terms of actual theology. And the Ethiopians, when they were really strong against it, they did see it's basically like the gateway drug. Whereas we think about like all the kind of damage like weed does and everything, they say that's the gateway drug. But then it's like, really, it's coffee, because it's not just on an individual basis. As a society, once you start saying, instead of like going for a walk or eating more healthy or something like that, I'll just have this and then I'm awake, then I'm ready to go. That means the whole idea of drug dependence is now normalized.
Yeah.
So whereas it wasn't before, so that I think is the real problem. That is a societal gateway drug, where it is just suddenly saying that line of thought where you say, I'll use a substance instead of being healthy or getting it, whatever it is you want to do, instead of doing that, I'll just use a substance. Even if I don't need this, because you think with medicine, it's like you're replacing something you need with something you have to get medicinally. That's one thing. But to think, well, you can still go for a walk. You can still, you'd just rather get a substance, give it you directly. Once you've opened that, it seems like no society was ever able to shut it again. And all the stuff they thought was worse, they couldn't stop, because then it just becomes a matter of hypocrisy, really.
Yeah.
Because they didn't do the theology properly.
Yeah, so once you normalise drug dependency using coffee, it's almost impossible then to draw the line at any other drug, because just the concept is conceded. Yeah, it's okay to have mood-altering, mind-altering substances freely used, freely consumed. But we wish to draw a line at some point over which some and not others and so on. But conceptually, the population believes that that is the right thing to do. Is it worth also just mentioning, but we'll have to do this briefly, is the way that this touches on work ethic? Because the association with drinking coffee and being alert to work and work longer hours and work harder with greater concentration, and that coffee is seen as a drug that enables people to work longer and harder, greater concentration. So it is affirmed, and I think quite a lot of companies explicitly provide coffee machines in the workplace, obviously because they wish their workers to be consuming this drug throughout the workday, because they wish their minds and moods to be altered in such a way that they get more work out of them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a key thing going on, and that's why everything else can be normalized, because it's suddenly like, well, I think working lots and doing lots of hard work is a good, so therefore I can overlook drug use if it achieves that. And you think there's loads of sectors in which people use meth and crack and so on, like loads of businessmen and so on do that, because it's the same mentality, basically, that you're just like, I think this is a good, so I can overlook the evils that is drug dependence, because that overweighs the other. And it's like, well, we can't start, it's like letting the devil ride.
Yeah.
And then he'll want to drive.
If you let the devil ride, he'll want to drive. So performance-enhancing drugs are frowned on in sport, but celebrated in the workplace. And maybe with that thought, we'll draw this episode to a conclusion, and perhaps have a drink of water.